Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the Research Meets Practice webinar today. HRD is a global organization made up and governed by and created for a human resource development scholarly community of academics and practitioners. I'm Kathy Bukacheski, the Executive Director of AHRD. In today's webinar, The Science of Adoption, Designing for Behavior Change in Organizations, our presenter, Kris Jennings, is a change leadership expert who combines behavioral science, design thinking, and positive psychology to help leaders deliver 90% plus adoption on their most important initiatives. Over 3 decades, she has designed and led change within and for world-renowned organizations, and is the creator of the Change Capable method and author of Inspired by Fear, Becoming a Courageous Change Leader. We will have time at the end of the webinar today for questions and conversations, which is why we have it in the meeting mode. And welcome, and thank you, Kris, for being here today.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm excited to have this conversation and we'll get us going. I've got about 40 minutes of content to share with you guys. And then, as Kathy said, we'll open it up to Q&A. And I will acknowledge I am coming very much from the practitioner point of view. So for those of you who are going to, for coming from the research side of things, I look forward to your questions, many of which I'll probably answer with a very pragmatic practitioner perspective. So let me get us into our presentation. Here we go. There, hopefully you're seeing a nice big screen. So today, science of adoption and designing for behavior change in organizations. Why are we here? What problem are we trying to solve? The reality is 70% of digital transformations still fail. And I looked up a stat to see how much are we spending on digital transformations. In 2024, that was 2.4 trillion. Trillion with a T, which if you think about 70% of that investment not resulting in behavior change and a change adoption, that's a problem I think that's worth solving. So why? I'm going to share a little bit about my perspective. I have both traditional org change management as well as behavior science and product design, consumer experience design in my background. And I have blended those two to kind of create my own version of how to drive adoption during organizational change. The traditional method for developing change plans, relies on logic and process. And when in reality, that's not how humans behave. So we are not rational actors. And that gap between people know what to do and people are actually doing it is where there is an opportunity for improvement. That's where transformations fail. So a little bit more about my background. I spent 17 years in-house doing big change in large organizations where there were lots of specialists and specialists in communications and in training and organizational development and effectiveness. And then finally, kind of a coalition of those various specialists into a cohesive team, a change team for large organizational transformation efforts. 14 years ago, I went out on my own and started my own business. And I had the wonderful opportunity of getting exposed to behavioral science. I was asked to support 4 national digital product launches in the healthcare space. And that was where I learned about some of the things, the concepts that we're going to talk about today. It was almost 10 years ago. And the first time I actually learned about behavior science, it was like the light bulb and my heart started, exploding with like, yes, this is what has been missing from how I approach my work. I came back and started applying some of those concepts into large digital transformation projects. Did 4 of those using my proprietary method, and what I saw was the results were dramatically different. So, hitting that 90% plus adoption was where I resulted in those transformation projects. I'm going to talk specifically about one of those 4. as part of our case study, and as we go through the principle and then application from the case study example. So, transformational change, and how do we talk about traditional OCM? When I talk about traditional organizational change management, I am thinking about the things where communication and training are heavy players in terms of the kinds of techniques used. That those are information heavy methods of trying to drive behavior adoption. The reality is information doesn't change behavior. So where do we look to in terms of, instead of doing launch emails, newsletters, town halls, job aids, trainings, videos, and repackaging all of that information, how do we actually look at the change in a different way? And behavior science offers one lens for looking at how do we actually change behavior, not just using information. Why? What have I observed over all of my years? And why did I actually write my book, Inspired by Fear? Because what I saw consistently was that emotions were playing a heavy part in leaders and their decision making, how fear was impacting leaders themselves, and then how it was rippling out to the stakeholders that they had to engage throughout a change. Those behaviors and emotions look like fear. They're resisting fear in the sense of like they're feeling fear and therefore they're resisting leaning into that emotion. I'm afraid I can't do this. I'm afraid that, our team's not capable. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. There's a variety of things that come up during change, and it's absolutely inherent in us as humans because change itself brings up that protective instinct, that survival mechanism. So that first response being a fear response is completely predictable and very prevalent when it comes to change. Other emotions, frustration, a form of anger, right? I'm frustrated that I don't know how to do this yet. I'm frustrated that I can't explain this to my team. I can't explain why we're doing this to my team. I'm frustrated that there's no clear roadmap for how we're going to get there. And a variety of other things where people feel like, hey, that anger sometimes gets it cast as resistance, but in reality, it's just an emotion that a human is experiencing. Grief, and of course, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the change curve. Most practitioners are familiar with that model in the sense that change is a transition from here to there. There is a loss component. We're moving from one state to another. And grief and how people express grief in the workplace varies wildly. And finally, all of this layers on top of depleted motivation. So when I have been working with large organizations, I don't think there has ever been an environment in which people weren't overloaded, overworked, and basically running on fumes. And so that depleted motivation becomes a factor on which we need to think about how are we going to introduce this when people have limited capacity, they have low energy, they're in cognitive overload. And that becomes a critical part of how we think about designing change from a behavior science perspective. Those emotions are all clues in terms of how do you design for a change where these emotions are present, and where can we anticipate those emotions happening in a particular change experience. I'm going to talk about three behavioral science principles today. These are the three that I come back to most often, and they are designing structured choices, friction, and social proof. So some of the practitioners in the room will probably recognize some of the language, right, or some of the techniques and say, oh, we talk about it in the sense of building a super user network or a change agent network for social proof. But what I want to share today is maybe to bridge that gap between how practitioners approach and have used various modalities with what the science and behavior science in particular has shared with us. So our first principle, design structured choices. How you present choices drives 85 to 95% adoption, versus 20 to 40% when left unstructured. And so when I think about change, I start with this design lens first. What are the big choices that are going to happen throughout this change? And how do I structure those in a way so that they're easy and they're as appealing as we can make them? The research on this from Brigitte Madrian. So this was in the late 1990s. Madrian was a young economist and was actually trying to understand the things that drove participation rates in 401k plans. And so she got a hold of a data set that an organization shared around a change in their participation rates from 37% to 86%. That was a dramatic improvement. And so she came in with the assumptions that they did something to change the investment options. They increased the match or had some other financial incentive, or they improved communications. Probably many of us would assume those things too. The reality was none of those things were true. The main thing that they did was change the default. And so a default is, in this case, the employer decided we're no longer going to make it an opt-in to the 401k. You're automatically going to be enrolled. And that means you make choice to opt out, right? So with our stats, 86% stayed opted in and 14% opted out. So what this illustrates is, and this was 20 some years ago. And so most of us probably go, yeah, this is what, we use today in our retirement plans as the primary way that employers offer their enrollment. In the same way that in health plans, right, you have a passive open enrollment is when you don't actually have to go in and make your health plan elections from year to year if nothing changes. So this idea of the default choice has been around and used within organizations for 25 plus years. So it's one of those things within organizational change that lens of what's the first choice? What is the default? What are we making for people to have as the standard, and they have to either opt in or opt out? I want to go a little bit deeper on this concept of choice and actually back up a little bit with the economists, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And for those of you who like a little bit of history, I like understanding how things kind of got from here to there. And the idea that in economics was that, people make rational choices. They use the data available and they always make the best choice possible. Well, we can all smile and laugh at that because we know that we ourselves that doesn't hold true, right? We literally, there are a lot of things that impact our choices. And what they discovered was through their prospect theory was there are a variety of cognitive biases. There are predictable ways in which people make irrational choices. And that's where, if you've heard the term predictably irrational, the idea is that, we can understand those biases and we can actually use them within our change design. In the same way that a choice architecture, so Thaler and Sunstein built on that that concept from Tversky and Kahneman, and actually said, how do we actually use this from a behavioral economics perspective? And Sunstein added the layer of where is there an ethical consideration? So how do we help people make the best choice for them, not just the choice that we want them to make? So all of these economists actually have led us to the place over the last almost 50 years to understand that there are irrational ways that people make choices and we can predict for them. So the three that I use within change design are default. So these questions are intended to kind of help spur that initial design of the change. What happens if someone does nothing? What's the default? So similar to our 401k example, if people do nothing, which is a choice, what will happen? The second question, how am I describing this choice? So how is the change being framed? And practitioners will recognize this like in the language of developing an elevator speech, a hallway speech, a why, or a vision statement. Those are all reasons, and loss aversion, status quo are actually cognitive biases to be aware as you are framing those why statements, framing those elevator speeches, because we have a tendency to think about things in that more upside will convince people. The rational way is to convince people with positives, when in reality, loss aversion, loss people are more likely to hold on to something, twice as likely to hold on to something as they are to see that upside. So for me, this is an area where I've had to unwind some of my traditional thinking and really evaluate, how am I framing this change and how am I framing the choices as they happen, which kind of gets us into point three, or question three, in what order? So sequencing is critical in the sense that in each change, there are moments in which it's like, I need to help someone just get curious. I need to help someone stick with it when it gets hard. And then how at the end do we realize the actual final change adoption, those behaviors that we're really truly measuring as saying, yep, this is success. We've achieved what we intended to with this particular vision. A case study. So I want to share the principles in action from the case study. This was a large financial records implementation. It was a company that had grown over acquisitions over the last several years. And therefore, they had duplicate systems, duplicate financial record keeping systems. They were consolidating those four systems down into one. And there was an HR component as well. And that would allow leadership to have real-time visibility into a complete single financial picture. So prior to some of the pain point that the team was experiencing prior to the implementation was the finance team was having to reconcile all of those financial records on a monthly basis before they could ever roll up reporting. You can imagine it was tedious and often led to questions around data integrity. The design question, as I entered it from a change perspective, was, what behaviors do we actually need each role to perform, and in what order for the budget cycle to be completed on time? And so, as you can imagine, the financial record keeping system supported the annual and quarterly updates on the budget, progress towards the hitting the numbers. And so we had to back up and look at who is that? Who does that involve? And what is the sequence of choices that they need to make in order for this vision to be realized? So our finance team, one thing we needed to absolutely do better than anything else on the change side was, months before go live, they needed to be in these behaviors and performing them comfortably and with confidence. So log in, using the various models and tools, completing month end. So we had both the planning side and an accounting side, and then using reports. And prior to go live, right? So this was 6 to 8 months of getting the finance team involved and repeating the process from a monthly basis for like 6 repetitions before we ever got to go live. That go live involved about 500 cost center managers. Those cost center managers had the task of logging in and completing their budget for the annual planning process. So this was a tightly compressed program where we were essentially asking cost center managers to log in, and they had only a month to complete their budgeting process. So it was intentionally a tight window. People leaders was a new role that had about 90% overlap with those cost center managers. And they had a small functional component where they were predicting headcount, asking for new headcount, and then also predicting retirement. So they would enter those couple of components within the budgeting process. And most of you probably know that salaries and actual human beings account for most of the budget. So this was an important change in terms of having full and integrated visibility between HR and finance. So, where did we end up? By the time managers logged in through that sequencing process, through offering those choices first to the finance team, finance had already been working in the system for months. And so, what cost center managers experienced by the time that login process and that go live happened was they saw that the people that they work with and that support them were already using the system. It normalized the new behaviors. On to principle number two, friction. This example is from a different. This is a different science example. So reduce friction for new behaviors while increasing it for old ones. Digital onboarding research shows 60 to 80% abandonment. Every additional step increases drop off. Okay, I'm going to translate that for the practitioners in the room. What does that actually mean? What's this actually talking from? So, the example that this uses is from mortgage applications and insurance forms. So, if you think about those types of documents, they're long and they're onerous, and so every single step there creates an additional drop off. And the application within organizations is things like adding additional layers of approvals or ways in which we're making roles duplicative. So that often comes up in terms of HR and a role within the business both have access to an approval, but who actually does it? And that creates confusion and therefore some abandonment for employees who are actually submitting those requests. When I think about friction, I think about how we want to make things easier and that relationship back to the depleted motivation that most organizations are experiencing. So, if we assume that people have low motivation, how do we design change to make it as easy as possible? And that first step, really, it's about that first step. So that first step needs to be as easy as possible so that it takes absolutely no effort. When people do it and they successfully do it because it's easy, they want to do it again. They feel good and they want to do it again. And this comes from BJ Fogg and Tiny Habits, who was one of the scientists that I got exposed to when I was doing my digital health work. And it has become kind of a lens for me personally, as well as when I think about changed design and behavior design, is how does that very first thing we're going to ask, that very first choice we're going to ask, how do we make it as easy as possible? From the case study, how we did this, we designed a couple of lenses. First, in that reducing friction and then increasing friction. So the new behavior, those three behaviors that we were trying to drive, the login, using the models, and using the reports. We did a lot of things that you maybe wouldn't think of as change and organizational change management, but it's things like we created single sign-on. We made sure that the single sign-on was easy to use so that if you were already on the company network, you were automatically logged into the system. No entering additional credentials, and made the process easy. We also saw early on that the homepage needed a navigation support. It wasn't easy to figure out where you were supposed to go. And so we just did a quick UX UI update on the homepage and we made the navigation easier to understand. Within the models for the finance team, we pre-populated data. We pre-populated that for the cost center managers as well. So when they logged in, they saw their existing budget, including all of the expenses that had been put against the previous year's budget. That actually made there was limited data entry. It made things a lot easier for users. And finally, we posted templates in the shared drives, both within the system and then within SharePoint within the team. That was a time saver, a productivity hack, so that team members could use and learn from one another of like, this template works in this situation. Here's what, go ahead and use it and share with each other. We sequence the behaviors into the smallest possible steps. So as I mentioned, that login first, making that as easy as possible. We tested that with small groups, first within our core project team, and then we slowly rolled it out. So by the time we were rolling out the login process to cost center managers, Essentially, we had practiced it numerous times, including the demo as well as troubleshooting security issues with that login process. By making that as frictionless as possible so that people did that very first behavior and did it successfully, they felt good. I'll share a little more on that success in a bit. Increased friction on the old behavior. So while you might look at only the new behavior and think, okay, how do I make that as easy as possible? The old behavior, you want to make it as hard as possible. And I sometimes this is the workarounds. And so if you have somebody on your team who like never follows orders or never follows process, that person is actually a great person to engage for this kind of exercise. I like to think of it as my criminal mind and how do I, if I were going to not obey this rule, how would I break it? And the funny thing was on this particular, it was we gotta get rid of the old system. And that sounds obvious, but the team hadn't planned for it because they were going to have duplicate systems for 6 months. It was the financial record keeping system. And so they wanted 6 months of overlap between the old and the new, just in case, right? In case the auditors came back and all this stuff. And the reality was, I was like, that's great and that's fine, but you've got to remove access. So remove the links from, the company intranet, change them out. The system admin actually disabled security, right? So that she had access, but others didn't. And if somebody needed something from that, they would have to ask her. And that actually sounds obvious, but it was an important step that we took in terms of making that old behavior more difficult to do. They also used Excel spreadsheets for their reporting. And so, not necessarily by malicious intent, somebody might run an old report and inadvertently be pulling data from the old system, which meant that they would have a report with bad data. So we went in and we made sure that all those Excel spreadsheets, the links were broken and that they wouldn't be inadvertently pulling from the wrong system. Those are a couple of ways that friction comes into play in terms of designing org change. Our last principle is social proof. So this has become even more important in the age of social media. And for practitioners who are thinking about change agent networks, super user networks, yes, absolutely. It's all of those and more. So Robert Cialdini is the researcher here, and using social proof to create peer accountability is one of the 6 principles that he talks about in his book, Influence. And essentially, it's not just about people looking to others for validation, it's people like me. So the importance within change is really thinking about when we think about the units, right? Of like, who are the units that we need specific behaviors from, and how are we going to get an early adopter or somebody who's going to model the new behaviors for others? I want to share a little bit of a background story too on an influence because it's one of my favorite books. Cialdini, when he was writing it, he went undercover to do research. And I love this because he was tired of buying things he didn't need. He was tired of donating to organizations that he'd never heard of, and he wanted to understand why. So he spent 2.5 years going undercover in what I will call the persuasive professionals. He went in as a used car salesman. He was a professional fundraiser and more traditional sales and marketing jobs. And what he noticed was they were all using these common set of techniques. They might be using different language to describe what they were doing, but it was coming back to these 6 techniques. He's actually added a 7th, unity, but the 6 original techniques were common across all those influencing professions, persuasive professionals. And then he wrote the book with the idea that if you were in one of those professions, you would understand how to use the techniques, but also for consumers. So for those of us who buy stuff we realized we didn't need, we would understand why. And so this is another great read if you're looking for more understanding around human decision making and what influences us to make purchases. In our case study, in my case study, so we use social proof like this one. There are so many examples, and I want to start to first with some re limited research that I've done on my own, informal research with some of my past clients and the users as we've gone through the training process. And so the question often gets asked, which training materials were the most used? Which ones were the most helpful? So, surveying users, the actual answer to that is 70% of people said the first place they go when they need help is a colleague, not the training documentation and not the help desk. And so, this to me is a reinforcement on the importance of social proof and using social proof strategically because embedding the desired behaviors within groups of people is the most likely way then that people are going to get answers as they're kind of struggling through those first efforts after a change. In the case study, we used social proof in a couple of different ways, both from the finance team side and then from the cost center manager side. So this was a large enough change that the team actually had identified a business change lead role prior to my joining the engagement. This was a finance professional. He had dedicated roughly 10% of his time to the change effort. He knew processes on both sides of the accounting and the planning and analysis sides of the finance team. He also was tech curious, so he was open to learning more about the technology. However, he had no idea what being a change agent meant. And so my job was to partner with him to be able to say, okay, what do we need to do? What should you be doing in order to influence this change? And the reality is it was getting him in and having him do the things that we were going to ask everyone else to do first. And so he was essentially our, canary in the coal mine of like going in and trying this stuff out, figuring out where there were friction points, and then being somebody who could model those new behaviors to his peers. We also created temporary roles. So within those cohorts, we had model leads. I think there were 8 models in total. And so what we essentially did was say, for each model, we're going to have a lead, and that person is going to get proficient enough to be able to teach that to their peers. But what it did was really essentially kind of normalize, like kind of some of how, instead of it feeling like formal training, it felt more like peer-based conversations, more like office hours where everyone was working together. So while the model lead might present the initial, if you will, training on the model, the peer-based orientation meant that it became much more collaborative quickly. So again, social proof in action. We also did that with reporting. So reporting was the functionality of this particular technology that was the most sophisticated. When the system implementer had presented the demo of the reporting capabilities, the team's initial response was overwhelm. Most people initially shut down, saw emotions of frustration, fear, grief, like why are we having to do this? Why are these new reports aren't better? They're just harder to use. And so we had to kind of come back to our principles around framing of like, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we want all of our data within one system so we can have accurate reporting and roll-ups. But those reporting leads, then essentially we broke down reporting into 3 areas, and we started with the easiest one, which was essentially press the button, run the report. The second one was a little more cumbersome and required some action from the report requester. And the third one was essentially an advanced reporting skill. And so what it allowed us to do was kind of progressively allow people to go at their own pace as they were learning these 3 types of reports. Social proof, having those embedded experts, having those people teach, and then be somebody that their peers could ask questions of was the only way that that reporting was going to get any stickiness and adoption. Finally, when it came to rolling out, so our business change lead and our system admin led the demos. They first did that within the finance team, and that built their confidence so that by the time they were rolling it out to cost center managers, they were comfortable and capable of handling any question that might come up. We did an unusual thing with this particular login process. Because there was such a compressed time frame to get that behavioral adoption, we did live group sessions. Those live group sessions were social proof in action. People saw their peers were doing it. We had the CFO and the finance team meeting, so people knew like, oh yeah, this is not optional. Everyone is using this. Everyone is doing this. And that actually allowed for people to also realize, hey, others have the same questions that I do, and then helping each other. So in the cost center managers, people actually answered each other's questions in the chat, which was fun to see. So the last little stat and fun behavior that I observed in those cost center manager trainings was that those 5 group sessions that we offered were done from a global accessibility standpoint. We had time zones, we had people around the world. And so you were going to come, it was voluntary. And so people had a choice of which one they wanted to go to. The thing that surprised me was that we had some people who came to all 5. And my impression at first, my instinct was, oh my gosh, we missed the mark. It took them 5 times to be able to do this. And so I reached out, asked more questions, got curious, and the answer was no, actually, it was just the opposite. It was reassuring to me that other cost center managers were having the same questions that I did. And I just wanted to be able to do this by myself by the end of the week. And so all 5 meant that I practiced the new behavior very quickly within a short period of time to feel confident. So then I want to close the loop on the case study, and we're getting close to our time for Q&A as well. So our emotions that were present in this particular change and how use them in the change design process. The fear and the way that the finance team was afraid of looking bad in front of their clients being their internal business partners. We sequenced the choice and the way that finance was going to be involved by moving things forward, moving that sequence forward early so that they would feel more confident and capable by the time the broader rollout happened. We saw the frustration very early with the reporting functionality, and that showed us a friction point where we needed to design to make that as small and as easy as possible. So that first reporting that we did, and anyone can run a report just by pressing a button, helps kind of reduce some of that frustration. It was a shift in emotions very quickly. Grief, in a long tenured organization, there is a longing for the past, right? I miss the days when we sat down together and we used pen and paper to write the budget. And the reality was it would be easy to dismiss that and to ignore the emotion, and the sense of loss that was happening there. But what we did was we honored it through one-on-one conversations and acknowledged the fact that the global sense of the organization had changed in that person's duration and tenure. Finally, depleted motivation. So this was initially a 6-month project, and that turned into 18 months. And why? Because the first budget cycle, the system wasn't ready. All that data integration took longer than expected from the 4 previous systems, which meant that the project team was essentially working double duty for a year and a half. That led to a lot of low motivation, low morale. Like we've been testing for a long time and we really need this system. By the time it was go live, they were absolutely ready for that combined system to be in place. So we honored the depleted motivation by looking at different incentives for the team. Another structure that often gets overlooked in terms of rewards and recognition, and that honoring of the new behaviors and the fact that you've modeled it for your peers. So our overall case study results in this 18-month implementation, we achieved 90% login across all of our populations within 30 days. We completed the budget cycle on time, and that delivered that whole picture view to leadership. So we delivered on that initial promise of what the intention was for the particular technology. The thing that was that I'm most proud of is the fact that the team was self-sufficient in 30 days. And so in a typical program for me, I'm on for at least 60 days in a hypercare state to support stabilization after a go live. So the fact that we were able to do that in half the time and that the team was confident in saying, "Yep, we got it. Thanks, Kris." And I also felt that way, was very rewarding for me personally. One thing to talk about from an ethical standpoint, so I've touched on it a little bit, but all of our scientists essentially came around during the course of their careers to just provide a distinction in how to use these principles for good, essentially. And the reality, the consensus is really that when you're helping someone make a choice that is in their best interest, that it is choice architecture, right? That's the line between influencing versus manipulation. And I these all having all of them be able to kind of say that across their careers definitely is something that I know I've wrestled with in the writing of my book. So I'm gonna stop talking and turn off the slides and allow us to kind of get back into Q&A mode.
Thanks so much, Kris. I think we'll just open it up for questions and just jump right in. We've got about 40 some people here, so please ask questions, comments.
Hi, this is Suma, and the question I have is how did you align culture of the company? Because as we talk about change management, one of the biggest things is, aligning that culture. Because so, how did you incorporate that?
Yeah. Great question. And I would say like the expression of grief was probably the representation of the culture. Um, because there had been so many acquisitions, there wasn't a single culture, right? There were definitely pockets, and it was from those recent acquisitions and a global culture as well, right? And so one of the things was simply to actually treat finance like this is a step forward for us, and we are doing all of this together. And so some of those things like the group session were designed intentionally to create that cohesiveness of like we are a global team that is going to operate with the same tools and the same processes. So maybe not so much like culture in the traditional sense of like how we honored what was, but it just because there were so many differences. There were different perspectives. Some of the team had nothing, right? And so it was a very different framing of the change for those people who were so excited to have any kind of tools versus those that were maybe coming from a system that, was maybe a little more user friendly because it was designed for just a small versus like now we have to design for the broader team. So yeah, I would say bringing everyone together and kind of treating the finance team in particular as a global entity, and then actually getting HR and finance to work together as well. Two functions that contribute to the budget every year, and working through kind of like how do we do this? How do we collaborate? How do we teach together? That was an opportunity to demonstrate as well the new unified organization.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
Thank you. This has been very educational. Appreciate it.
Good. Which principle stood out to you? Can I put you on the spot?
Sure. I'm just gonna peek at my notes, but I think the framing was or
Mhm.
the I'm sorry, the friction, reducing the friction. And I loved how you talked about they couldn't have access to the old stuff anymore. So it's kind of It
Yeah,
just,
yeah, you'd be surprised how many times that's happened.
yeah,
Of like we need to turn the old system off. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I can see that. I'm thinking back to a leadership development program I taught last year and custom designed and based on what you thought is kind of, and I changed that and that and
Yeah, 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 yeah.
that.
Yes, and my criminal mind, that's when I definitely I think about like, what's going to keep people like, hey, I'm going to keep doing it my way. I have to call on my criminal mind to, like think about the workarounds and the ways that I want to keep doing it the way that I always have because it's
Right,
easier. The reality is like once you've got a habit formed, it's then you're on autopilot. That's the very definition of a habit.
right,
So how do you kind of like help people understand that it's like, it's a little bit harder at first, but then eventually
right,
it will become easier. So
right. And often, right, it's not as big a deal as they thought it would be.
yeah, yes, yeah, 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 right. And the sooner you look back and 6 months, have gone by and you realize that no, it actually was not that big of a deal. Why did we? Now we're on to the next change. So
Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome.
Kris, thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
One of the things that it kind of resonated with me was the sequencing.
Hmm.
Um, getting, demonstrating the buy-in from the upper part, from
Yeah,
the finance group, and then letting them set the example. I
yeah,
think is so powerful because so many times when change is implemented, it's like there's lip service from the top,
yeah,
right? And not really implementing. And so when those that are challenged to implement say, well, they're not even doing it type thing. So I think that sequencing is very critical
yeah, I would
in that.
absolutely agree. And it's one of those things that I advocate for in the testing process. So a lot of my work has been in the technology side of things where there is, some form of testing. Technical testing does the functionality work. And you can treat that as like, can you go into the system and do A, right, and get result B? Or you can say, okay, here's the reality is we want people who are going to have to do that in the new world. It's testing as an opportunity to practice that because it's about confidence. Again, coming back to emotion and about like, hey, I want to feel like I am ahead of the curve because when my clients, my business unit cost center managers ask me for help, I don't want to look bad. I want to look like I know what I'm doing. And so kind of like helping project teams or technical teams, think about it as less tactical and more testing is less tactical and more strategic as a way to influence stakeholders.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Chris, I have a question.
I hope I have an
I'm,
answer.
I know, this is really a good session for me at this time. So these are great principles, and I'm trying to think about application of these principles on something a little different for rolling out a phased enterprise-wide workforce identification verification
Okay.
process, which will impact the whole workforce because we kind of have to go back and verify things, and also will impact new candidates. But it would just be like for them coming in. I think it would just be they're adopting the process and doing what
Yeah.
needs to be done. But for people who are very leery of biometrics and those kinds of things, I'm wondering how are they going to feel about this? We've already thought and talked a lot about this, but applying these principles, where, for example, people practice a few months. So I'm thinking,
Mhm.
well, this may not be hands-on practice. Maybe it's more about discussions, having open discussions about it, maybe speaking about the risk. I wanted to maybe get your thoughts around this. I haven't put together all my thoughts yet, as you can tell.
Oh yeah. Oh, and I'll
Yeah.
try and do my best on the read on the
Yeah.
context, but it sounds like you're already down the right path, which is thinking about the different groups that might be impacted. And so if you think about a new hire versus an existing,
Mhm.
employee, and you probably have different employee types that have different needs.
Right.
So I might think about like how can you prioritize those different existing groups to a certain degree, as you said, like a new hire, they don't know what the existing process is. So it's actually probably the easiest change for them. They're just doing what they're
Mhm.
being asked from their new employer. And so I might look at like those existing employees and kind of and figure out from the groups of like what are the friction points going to be and where can you reduce that either through like a small test, right? Of like what if we try this or like and could you get feedback so you can identify some of those emotional trigger points, flash points to then make and massage the rollout into the broader group. That's might be one way I would
Yeah,
attack
that
it.
that makes sense. I appreciate that. So it looks like we may need to break down one of our phases into smaller phases, I guess, for lack of a better
Yeah.
term. Yeah.
Yeah, and test and iterate is a big part of like
Hmm.
hopefully it came through today, but like try stuff, see what works, and you know what I mean? Try it in a small part of your group and then figure out what you learn and then roll it out more broadly. So and I hate to bring it up, but a cognitive bias is planning fallacy, right? So when I hear the word phase, I think, oh no, we
I
get
know.
fixated on like the timeline, and it's like, yeah, it's probably not going to happen the way that it's planned.
Right. Well, I'm already determining that and talking with IT and trying to help them connect the dots on, there are dependencies on some decisions being made, and you can't stick to the same go live date if you're pushing all of the work that organizational change management does into crunch time because
Mhm.
there are
Yeah. Yes.
cascades that have to happen, messaging, from upstairs. Those kinds of things cannot happen overnight. And I
Yeah.
think they began getting it today. I'm just really trying to learn how to ask them questions to help open up their thinking a little bit about those
Yeah.
things. So, yeah, this is really helpful today. So, thank you. Appreciate
Yeah,
this.
you're welcome. And that when you're talking about crunch time, like that was one of my other pain points and my work
Hmm.
around traditional org change is like everything's around this date, right? So like, the 2 weeks prior to go live and then the, 30 days, 60 days after it. And it's like, in that, why were we expecting everything to happen magically within that, chunk of time? And so one of the, things that really would also challenge you to think about is like how can you bring things forward, right? What are some of those design choices that you can make around the change that are happening 6 months before you're intending to actually put, a document in or a process, a technology process in front of someone.
Right.
Chris,
If I go
Chris, in
ahead.
the chat, there's something in the chat around
Okay, I'll
organization.
open
If
my
any
tab.
organization had 3 reorgs plus 2 new tools in a few months or 2 years, people are stopped caring
Hmm.
how to motivate towards change. And certainly around tech stack has become tech pile. There's just so
Hmm.
many things, tools thrown at everybody is like, how do we help them become carpenters rather than all of these tools coming at them? So
Yeah.
how do you motivate them towards change?
Yeah, and I might reframe that because I think one of the things we think is that we should motivate, we should amplify, right? And rather than looking at it as how do we reduce the friction? How do we make it easier? So like maybe flip that thinking, right? Of like rather than how can we motivate, but how can we make it easier for people? And easier means that, so Kathy, to your point, like tech stack, right? Of like I have yet to be in a change as even as complicated of the stuff that I've done, where everything applies equally to everyone. And so figuring out, I have a tool within it's one of the tools I use in my methodology is really like, what's your bullseye? Like, who's at the center of the bullseye? In that transformation case study example, like it was one person in the bullseye, the system admin. There was one system admin and a multi-million-dollar project that was also the single point of failure. right? And so getting that on the risk log of like we have to figure out how to de-risk that, but also, then kind of prioritize our in our bullseye, like who we're going to spend time on. We spent more time on finance than we did on cost center managers than we did on people leaders. And so that too is like another way of thinking about when you're rolling out how to actually like you don't have to motivate everyone. Like how can you reduce friction for the person in the middle, right? And getting her a backup was the thing that we did. So I gotta put the feedback thing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you're doing that, I just want to note I put in four links into the chat. One is it's a link to the AHRD website, Research Meets Practice. We have a few members of that team on this call. So if you want to learn more about AHRD's initiative around getting researchers and practitioners together to talk and have connection. And this is one of the things that we're doing is a series of webinars. There's a link to the AHRD Insights online magazine, which is on Substack. We are looking for articles and also for people taking a look at that and sharing. And then we have the events link to the HRD. We're going to be planning a few more webinars, research meets practice and practice meets research this summer, and then also looking at some workshops and things. So we want your feedback on that as well. And then there's the link to the HRD YouTube channel where we've had the past research meets practice webinars and where Kris's recording will go as well. But thank you. And if you could provide feedback, that would be awesome. And if there are any other questions or comments, you can certainly email me at Kathy@ahrd.org, Kathie.org. And really appreciate everybody's time today. And Kris, thanks so much. Really,
Yeah, I love
yes,
the opportunity to collaborate with people who think very, very differently. And so this has been fun. Thank you.
absolutely. Have a great day.
Yep. Take care.
Bye.